Today I'm joined by Jacob Phillips. Jacob is a writer and an academic and the author of Obedience is Freedom. Welcome, Jacob.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I'm glad to have you on. I really like the book, and I think it's an interesting new approach, and it's almost kind of in a new genre, in a genre of its own at the moment. I don't think this is kind of an explicitly right wing book. It's a book of kind of cultural criticism, philosophy, kind of introspection as well. It's got poetic elements to it. I think it's an interesting. I feel like this is going to be maybe a larger genre of books, and I feel like this is a kind of a first move into the space, which I think is extremely promising and interesting. And I wonder if we could start with what in your personal life, I mean, what is the book a reaction to? I mean, what have you experienced, and what prompted you to write it?
Well, it's interesting you say it's not a right wing book because it was definitely prompted by the discourse and the world of discourse that we're in. I suppose it was if we're thinking in terms of the genre or the collage of genres that are at play in the book. I suppose the problem I have with the kind of stuff that we're generally responding to in terms of the craziness in the world at large at the moment is the complete lack of soul. That's what bothers me. So with stuff like identity politics and wokeness and stuff like that, I just think there's a very bleak world emerging through this stuff without soul, without imagination, without poetry, without all the things that really make human life kind of rich and interesting and unpredictable and fun. So I suppose it was it ended up being the way it was, this book, because I wanted to write something with soul, which as an academic is generally not encouraged. I mean, one has to be a lot more scientific. So it was partly due to the fact that I realised that the writing I had to do in my professional life was also a bit soulless, which is fine. I enjoy that. That's great. But I just found the need to kind of try and capture a bit more soul, really, to react against this increasingly bleak and soulless world we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean it comes out of the writing, but there's also I feel like this is kind of a feeling that you've tapped into, and obviously the book is kind of your response to this crisis of meaning that I see a lot of people responding to, and in an interesting way, a lot of people are saying, okay, responsibility is not on the table until certain conditions are met. So the idea that taking responsibility for anything in the world, as being, the last man, is too high of an ask. There's nothing to take responsibility for. We're just peering into the abyss, and there's really nothing to hang on to. Like responsibility for anything within the state of play, within the field of options that we see in front of us, is essentially a trap. You're tethering yourself to something, to a sinking ship. So you should essentially detach and I don't know. Uh, exactly what happens after this next step, but it feels to me that you've kind of taken a leap of faith here. Obviously you're a man of faith, so maybe that has something to do with it, but yeah, I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, um, yeah, I think that's right. I get frustrated with a lot of stuff on discourse from both sides, actually, that just seem to have an incredibly cold understanding of human existence, whereby we kind of engage with stuff prior to some conditions being met, which we consider to be advantageous to ourselves. And I think that's I think that partly reflects the way in which what those on the left would call late capitalism has kind of affected the most profound, intimate aspects of our subjectivity, even to the degree that everything's become kind of choice on the basis of self-advantage, maximizing one's own self-advantage. Everything's conditional in terms of what suits oneself. And I suppose in kind of normal life, I see all around me people making really irrational decisions which aren't necessarily in their best interests. And I'm quite interested by that. And I think we're increasingly living in a situation where everything's conditioned on kind of self-interest. I suppose the fact my background is on the left is part of what's going on here, really, because stuff that seemed to me kind of natural left-wing impulses immediately, very quickly in around 2010 became right-wing impulses, and this is one of those examples. So for me, taking responsibility for others was a natural impulse of the left, the kind of traditional economic left-wing thinking that I grew up around. Now, I've moved a million miles away from that, and I wouldn't describe myself as left-wing anymore. But not making decisions purely on the basis of maximizing self-advantage seemed to me to kind of come from that world, or to speak naturally to that world. So I just kind of got increasingly frustrated with this way in which everything's presented as a kind of choice, and even to the point of discourse on the right about, for example, birth rates and the issues with really low birth rates in Western countries. In the UK, people will point out how difficult it is economically for people in their 20s to have kids. And it's a really big problem, and it should be sorted out, and there need to be policies to make it easier. But, human beings don't have kids because they can afford them. Human beings have kids because we have kids. And, we're configured to share our lives with our offspring. That's just a fact of life. And making it purely about economic conditions being met does frustrate me a bit. So I think there's something just so much richer going on there.
Yeah, I think this is like you said, an interesting case study, because kind of the takes from both sides are they're essentially utilitarian, and you can see this, but that's, I mean, you call it late capitalism, but I think it's an outgrowth of just, a certain level of comfort. I mean, it's independent of what exactly caused that comfort and that, distance from nature, distance from the conditions that essentially just needed to be met for survival back in the day. There was a certain interdependence between people, that just the fact that you could exercise the option, the revealed preference, as economists call it, to move out and live alone in a condo or something like that. There are obviously all sorts of negative side effects to this, that people are starting to understand, that living in a little concrete cube all alone for your 20s is not necessarily the most mentally healthy way to spend them. But it's still a revealed preference, because a lot of people talk to me about, oh, we love extended family. Are you willing to move in with your in-laws? Because that's essentially what used to need to happen, because there was, there was one house, you had multiple generations living in it. And I feel like a lot of that is downstream from all of these, essentially little preferences, accumulation of little things, of little comforts. And we got to this point where, if you can exercise preferences in all of these directions, why not continue living comfortably without the hassle of having children? And yeah, it seems to be quite widespread on the right as well. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a more traditional religious right, and yeah, they associate children to a certain status within that group. But a lot of people on the right, especially people who are kind of in the manosphere, don't necessarily need or like or understand why you would, I don't know, subject yourself to the risk of getting, I don't know, so-called divorce raped by women, by having their children and things like that. So there's, the world is dark and full of dangers. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. It was a weird one. I mean, my wife and I had a first kid when I wasn't a proper trad. I mean, I was in my 30s, as is normal here. But it was just seeing the reaction to having a kid, and how just, the natural reaction among everyone is just that this is a positive, celebratory thing. Full stop. It's just an unqualified good. It's just life, and there's the generation of life, and that's great, and it makes people happy. And when a baby is born, and that was kind of a revelation to me, to see the way people reacted. I mean, obviously I was happy as well, but it was just something that we seem to have lost in our culture. Where you've got you got the kind of extreme kind of climate emergency, um, hatred of generating a Western life that's going to have this massive carbon footprint and destroy the universe on the one side, but then also um, this quite strange and now probably quite dated kind of libertine variant of the right that we don't see it, like the stuff you were talking about with the manosphere and stuff like that. Um, and it just seems to me the most basic impulse. And if we really got ourselves into a situation with discourse and culture wars and identity politics, whereby the simple fact that having a baby is an unqualified good is something that we've lost or we're losing in the society in which we're in. Um, I mean, a priest or minister of the Anglican Church, I think last year, he and his wife had a baby, and he tweeted something like, having a baby is wonderful. All of you should go forth and multiply, have kids. And he got called in and, got cancelled and asked to remove the tweet because it was insensitive and it was upsetting people. And, you just think, how do we get here, really?
Yeah, yeah, and it is interesting because I mean, I guess one my next question for you would be, the title is obedience is freedom, but I guess the larger question is obedience to what, which is also kind of the question that a lot of people on the so-called dissident right are asking, and they're coming up short to the answer to what, because the impulse is there. You see that people are striving for hierarchy, for leadership, for structure, for looking up to something higher, but they seem to be coming up short with the actual direction that they should channel their energies into, because nothing is worthy enough. So I wonder what your answer is to this. I mean, what should we be obedient to? What can we be obedient to?
Well, I think we're working that out at the moment. I mean, I don't think we're at a position whereby um, a kind of full ideological position, even if it does end up being ideological, can be offered in answer to that question. I mean, when I looked into the word obedience and its etymological roots and so on, it seems to come from ancient verbs for hearing, for listening, and being attentive. And to me, looking at some uses of it in Latin and Greek and in scripture, it seems to be, or it can be broadened out into a kind of attentiveness to reality as reality is. So accepting that reality isn't what you want it to be. It's not purely the real world isn't purely a theatre for your own wish fulfillment and for self-will to run riot. Everywhere we're limited by virtue of being human, and accepting those limits, actually learning to love those limits and exist within them, is obedience. And that's the kind of very broad kind of philosophical view I have of obedience. I mean, in a way, it was quite unfortunate in that the timing of the book was such that when I was approached and asked to do it, it was in the early days of COVID. And I think for a few people, the title, because it was published after COVID, the title was obviously difficult to stomach and became associated with the kind of anti-COVID, anti-vax kind of stuff. And I get that, but it just wasn't part of that at all. But ultimately, I mean, I think it's really about obedience to the nature of things, accepting the nature of things, which is partly metaphysical. I don't just mean biology. And the most obvious example is human nature and accepting human nature the way it is. The most obvious kind of flashpoint around that is the fact that human nature is always sexed as either male or female. That's the most obvious example. It's something that I think needs to be accepted obediently as a fact of life. But in a more kind of, I suppose, a self-indulgent kind of mood, one might want to imagine what it would be like to have a political authority which adequately represents that sort of profound metaphysical truth, which I think would need to have spiritual religious dimension. And if I was going to go completely kind of, if I was going to unleash my imagination completely, it would be some kind of integralist 21st century techno-futurist superstate. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I think there might be a few steps between here and there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you mentioned COVID, and I think it was an interesting moment because some forces tied into obedience, tied into duty, tied into an obligation to others were summoned there. I mean, people had that reaction, especially in the first few months. You could see it kind of tied into the NHS cult with the clapping, and our the nurses and all this stuff. Um, but at the same time, it feels like not only did that fizzle out quite quickly, but it feels like a strange phenomenon related to that. I mean, it was kind of, we're all in this together for 5 minutes, but then it was kind of pulled back into the more powerful current of discourse. And I feel like there's something more profound there about because the larger question, okay, obedience to what? And I feel like the models and the ideas that we maybe want to be obedient to are now produced and propagated by something outside of us, something outside of our communities and our little local status hierarchies. It comes from the machine, and it's very fragmented. And whatever story happens, whatever event happens in the wider world that might maybe tickle our senses for the kind of classical type of obedience, it slowly, or maybe quite fast, is drawn back into these stories about these larger narratives. And yeah, I mean, it seems to me like that's every new show I have about this, the more I am kind of amazed and frightened at the possibilities coming out of this technology. I mean, I still don't know exactly what to think about it, but it's warping our way of looking at ourselves and at the world in real time. So yeah, I mean, what do you think about kind of this layer of technology on top of it? Because it feels to me like, okay, this is definitely one of the major elements in any sort of social analysis, in any sort of interpretation of what the present is doing to us.
Yeah, definitely. And COVID was kind of the point, I think, where um, human lives reduced into aggregate numbers of swarms as deduced by technology kind of took over. That's what it represents, really. And in terms of what I'm trying to get at with obedience and freedom in the book, to to bring that into what happened with COVID, would be to say something like, assume COVID is what it was built to be at the time. Um, that people would be made aware that there's a nasty bug going around, and society would be strong enough and have enough kind of high trust and responsible functioning for people to adjust their behaviour accordingly. Of course, that's not what happened. It became all about coercion, and the degree of uh, compliance was all measured by kind of technology. So we had this weird stuff going on. I remember in London, the parks having helicopters, police helicopters swarming all over them, with using heat sensitive cameras to deduce the amount of activity going on, the amount of people in the park. And when it tipped over a certain level, having a corresponding change in the publicity that was being used and the police presence on the streets and stuff like that. So it's all being done through this kind of technological way. And I mean, I wrote a thing for a now defunct magazine called Jacobite around the time about that, and about how, if COVID is what it was built to be, that we were in this kind of entering this kind of radical post-liberal space, but not in a particularly good way. In that we'd kind of lost all our sense of choice, because the body kind of could be afflicted by this virus, but at the same time, society was actually reaching this point of extreme manipulation of choice through through this highly emotive stuff around clapping, and but more often actually through kind of coercion or kind of weird threats that if you go out today you'll kill your granny and all this kind of stuff. So definitely what it represents was technology kind of taking over, and what some would call the swarm. And I suppose it connects to what I was saying originally around soul. Really, I mean, I don't find statistics particularly helpful. I know lots of people on the right love statistics, and it's all about the graph and it's all about the line. But I just don't think any individual human life can be reduced to just being a number on a graph or a statistic. And there's a kind of irreducible complexity and uniqueness to each human life. There's a kind of metaphysical personhood prescribed to each person, to each individual, each human being. And again, I just think we could be entering this kind of bleak, kind of soulless world. Now, we all use technology. We can't get away from technology. I'm not a kind of Luddite or anything like that. And I'm interested in the way, technology changes the way we think and the way we relate to the world. And I think it can be and should be and needs to be explored in a very positive way, in the same way that, developments in art and science always have been in the West, particularly. Yeah, there's a real danger that, we're just going to end up in some situation where extremely powerful people can kind of move us around and manipulate our emotions through technology in very kind of sinister ways, I guess.
Yeah, I think it really, if there weren't enough question marks around democracy, the advent of these technologies and, the sheer capacity for emotional manipulation and propaganda and, the use of what I call like the rage anecdotes and, because you're saying, okay, you don't like statistics, but what's very powerful on the internet is not necessarily the graph. The graph appeals to the autistic, but a video illustrating an offense to your perceived group or the group that you show allegiance to. You had this with George Floyd, you had this all the way back to Rodney King. You can see this now on the right with essentially the daily show of I don't know, black kids beating up white kids, whatever, world star hip hop type stuff. Yeah, it's this seems to be the emotional currency of the internet, and it's, I don't know, it's very powerful. If you see this like in your village, it's a different thing because you have the power to take action, to use ostracism, to, I don't know, navigate the situation by talking directly to the people. But when you see all of this stuff at scale, it really feels to me like it's some form of mental torture, of essentially emotional terrorism, and it's really warping the fabric of our connection to each other, and it's also adding to this disembodied um, relationship that we have to real life. Nothing's more interesting than this. This is the most interesting stuff that you can see. Someone attacking you. It's tribal conflict nonstop, or curated especially for your interests. So I don't know. It feels a bit like if we were to use technology in a wise way, this particular thing is, an info hazard. It's just subjecting yourself to info hazards every day, and and liking it and participating in it like it's a game.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way in which kind of recreation and war kind of come in the same thing. That's what the culture wars does. It's a kind of extreme form of Cold War where everything becomes riven with contention, and recreation, isn't it? I can easily think, oh, I've got a spare couple of hours in the evening, I'll go on my phone and I'm on Twitter. But that recreation I'm enjoying is actually antagonistic and confrontational and frustrating and all the rest of it. But it's really weird because a lot of kind of wokeness and stuff is prefaced. I'm becoming increasingly of the view that the woke discourse is actually underneath it all this mental health discourse. I'm increasingly coming into that kind of view that it's kind of prefaced around, this will make me ill if this happens. If people do this, this will make me ill, or will make people ill. And there's a threat of suicide if you hold this view, or other people are upset or offended by this. So you're endangering other people's mental health. And there have been some really big shifts in like the last 10 or 20 years in understanding mental health, away from, some people develop a mental illness of different sorts and they need an intervention or treatment and you hope it works. And there are specialists that do that, to this kind of widespread blanket approach to where there's a spectrum of mental health that we're all on, and we'll all occasionally suffer from mental health problems. Mental health applies to everybody, ill health and health. And that, is something lots of people have found really useful as a way of approaching it. But what's weird is if you combine it with the stuff you're talking about, the info hazard, and the kind of normalization of extremely emotive viewing through technology all the time, and the fact that I think it's fair to say most people in the West now are living with a kind of a mode of cognition which is probably very similar to what is named today as ADHD, because of the constant barrage of stimulation, highly emotive stimulation, tapping into kind of group reflexes and all that kind of stuff. We're actually living internally through that, like somebody kind of in a really extreme and dangerous kind of volatile prison in terms of the level of stimulation where you can never properly rest. Someone can get at you at some point in any way. And the minute you open your eyes in the morning, you're on guard. And yeah, if there is going to be a kind of a healthier relationship with technology that people develop, it's going to have to be around, quite straightforward, limiting and rationing one's access to it and going into it knowingly, rather than just having it, notifications pinging off all the time, that kind of stuff. Because I think if you actually take a step back, certainly living in a city like London, if you take a step back and actually observe the way people are engaging with reality with their phone in their hand, we're living in a state of kind of widespread internal chaos, really.
Yeah, it is interesting as well because it kind of stays with you as well. Even if you're very online and you engage in this culture war type stuff, it's a kind of occupies real estate in your brain even when you put it down because the culture war keeps waging. It's somewhere in there just processing in your subconscious. And yeah, it's very interesting, but it's I always wonder how much of myself am I giving over to this because I have moments where I'm just cooking dinner, whatever, changing nappies, doing all sorts of stuff like that, and then just like have a flash of a potential tweet. I don't even know exactly where it comes from because I was focused on what I was doing in the moment. But then I'm just like, yeah, indeed, I need to comment on this El Salvador thing. But yeah, it's very it is very strange just because it is so emotionally powerful and yeah. Uh, I wonder. I mean, for you in your own life, because you're obviously someone who's wrestled with this. You've been in these spaces. You've spent some time in the discourse on the right, on the left. I mean, what has your trip been? What has your journey been back to obedience? How do you live out these values?
Um, Gosh. Well, I guess it's come quite naturally to me. I mean, my as is kind of alluded to heavily in the book, my teens and stuff in the 90s, where I was, in deeply engaged in, I suppose, what would be called, if you were thinking in terms of ideology, kind of a left libertarian kind of space. Um, and, it was all kind of about freedom, but I kind of discovered and I document in the book how a lot of that freedom was kind of completely illusory and actually became quite enslaving on people. Um, but then I got very disillusioned with that in my early 20s, and kind of sorted my life out and became religious and kind of began again really. Um, and from there, I suppose, the kind of stuff I talk about in the book around duty to family and to a certain extent loyalty. I mean, I don't want to be kind of sanctimonious or moral about it, but I found that a lot of that stuff could actually come quite naturally to me, even though I would have thought, looking back at my life up to that, up to that point, if I can do it, anyone can do it. I suppose basically was the kind of view I came to. If I can go from the way I used to live and the circles I used to move in and the people I used to know, to kind of holding down a job and feeding my kids and being married and keeping a roof over their head and having kind of vaguely stable, normal family existence, with the occasional bit of madness through the culture wars, that it's kind of natural. And, I suppose I just came to the view that deep down, this is the way people are kind of supposed to live. I don't mean, my lifestyle is right for everybody, but I think we are estranged from kind of what we want. And I just saw, take for example, relationships. So, like, I knew loads of people in what would today be called open relationships and stuff like that. complete chaos. Like everybody was so unhappy. Nobody liked it. Everybody, it just seems so obvious to me. And I wouldn't have accepted it early on when I was in those circles. But after a few years, it just became kind of unequivocally, undeniably obvious that deep down everybody just wanted a monogamous relationship. And after 3 or 4 years of watching people just tear their lives apart, arguing, falling out, complete chaos, living in houses with people in these very kind of unstable relationship situations, I just came to the view that I think deep down most people just want monogamy. I think it's quite a natural human reflex, and people need to tap into that. Um, Similarly with other stuff, I mean, all the kind of big culture wars, touchstone issues, I didn't give way on any of them easily. Early on, I would have been like, this is monogamy and stuff is, outdated and all the rest of it. Even with abortion, there were people I knew who had abortions, and I saw what it did to them. I saw what it did to them, and thought, I don't think what we're being told, um, in that kind of world, I don't think what we're being told is true, because you can see the effect it has on people. So I suppose in terms of the way I live my life now, it's just trying to. It's very natural. I don't wake up every morning and think, right, how can I be obedient and dutiful and responsible and loyal today? Um, I suppose there's a certain joy in being normal as well, especially if you've tried really hard to be kind of radical and different and all the rest of it, and to be a libertine. There is immense joy in just being normal. I mean, the fact that the word normal is being cancelled is completely ridiculous, and you can't speak of norms anymore. But the fact is, there are norms, and the norms reflect human nature. You know, and the kinds of things I'm talking about, I think, are reflective of human nature. It doesn't mean there aren't people who can't relate to those norms, and there's always going to be kind of people outside of them. Um, but it's just nice to live a normal life sometimes.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that a lot of people have kind of gone down that path. I know my friend Mary Harrington's also kind of been associated with more kind of anarcho-libertarian type movements in the 90s in London. And I think when you have contact with the people in these groups, the dynamics in them, you get to witness something that I think a lot of people who don't want to be extreme, don't, are just kind of cruising along life and, being obedient to whatever is in front of them, not necessarily in a very thought out way, is you just don't get to see you don't get to realize that behind a lot of this experimental living is essentially like a very dark abyss, and you don't get to see the people who fall into it, because I think anyone who's been associated with groups like this, I mean, I've had quite a lot of friends who've fallen into drug abuse, all sorts of mental issues from repeat abuse of either psychedelic or even weed. I mean, a lot of people, say, "Oh, weed's a panacea; it's going to cure your cancer." Yeah, it could also make you go insane, which I've seen multiple times. Just the idea that you have to reinvent the wheel just so that your life is an act of self-creation, so just so you can say, that you're living in some form of authenticity. I think that's a trap that maybe a lot of people who don't get to witness other people falling into these traps, or maybe not in danger of falling into these traps themselves, don't actually grasp. They don't. You don't understand how hot and sulfury it is in hell until you're at the gates and until you're negotiating with like the Cerberus there, and it's dark. So I think, though, I mean, in kind of Gen X millennial circles, you see a very um, strong contingent of reactionaries, just because they've been through these things, and I think that's could be an important cultural force. I mean, just the people that I know, there's quite a lot of reaction to not only it was also kind of. I don't want to, lay the blame on boomers, but our parents' generation was very lax with us. There was I'm just saying, what would I've been obedient to? There was literally nothing to be obedient to, except for kind of the haunting specter of my dad as a person, because he was kind of a larger than life character. But there was no overarching structure over my life growing up. So essentially, it was I was left to self create very early. It was create myself whatever I wanted. And it was, I don't know, it was, I guess, not necessarily of, I can't even blame my parents. It was just the way things were. It was also kind of the Wild West in Romania back then, pretty much in the West as well. And yeah, it was just the historical circumstance of, everyone was minding their own business and creating their own authentic life. But yeah, I don't know if this, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can really relate to that. And my parents, obviously, quintessential boomers, 1960s boomers. Um, yeah, and so you get to this weird space. There's people like who've ended up, you know, reacting against that kind of stuff because they've been through it, they've seen it firsthand. You can kind of think to yourself, well, maybe we should just let everyone go completely mental because they'll find their way back. But the reality is, a lot of people don't find their way back.
No, I
The
know many
people,
of them.
exactly, the people we're talking about are the minority. Um, it's actually really the vast majority of people don't find their way back. And if I think, I think back to the circles I was in back then, um, the sheer number of people I know who died is way above the kind of average of people who should be dying in their late 20s, early 30s. And there's a whole range of different reasons for that. But it became normal in that world to know quite a few people who died, when you're in your late 20s. Um, so it's a weird one because growing up in the 80s and early 90s, the default setting of the culture was the kind of norms that I now think are a kind of wonderful, exciting thing that I've discovered, like kind of marriage and being heterosexual and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, if when that's all kind of you unpick all of that stuff and you kind of unleash chaos. The fact is that those same people who would uncritically and unthinkingly just have accepted those norms in the 80s when I was a kid are the same people who are now unthinkingly and uncritically accepting the norms of kind of wokeness and identity politics because that's now the default setting of the culture we're in. And I suppose those of us that have come from this um, have experienced that chaos or smelt that sulfur close up can recognize it immediately and say, hang on, there's something. It's like, you might give it all new names, but I recognize some of this stuff and I know where it's coming from. And in both worlds, it does inevitably always develop, a kind of dark spiritual edge as well. You see that in both those worlds before long. Um, Symbols, ways of thinking, the vibe kind of turns and you can kind of recognize that when you see it. When you smelt the sulfur, the sulfur might now be dressed up in much more amenable, colourful, attractive ways, but the smell because you've seen it before. And I'm grateful that one can recognise it for what it is and where it will lead, which we're seeing increasingly more and more in the way that the extreme end of the kind of the woke stuff is going. It is beginning to enter into pretty extreme territory, I think.
Yeah, and it really is, just letting people go like lambs to the slaughter in a way, and that's, I think, the main impetus, I think, for a lot of people who are talking about this, because you can have a quiet life and just be traditional, be trad in your own back garden, as we are many times encouraged by people who don't think we could be traditional on the internet. But essentially, why I wanted to speak about this stuff was because I wanted to say the things that I couldn't say to the people in my life somewhere, and maybe they stumble upon them and maybe they take them seriously, because it's hard to have these confrontations in real life because it really strikes at the core of people's identity, of this essentially artistic project that they've embarked upon to create their own lives, in a unique way. And there's also quite a lot of so-called cognitive dissonance when you reach your, let's say, mid 30s, and you're starting to have the downturn, where you like you mentioned, kind of dark symbols start popping up. It's like 4 a.m. at the party and things are winding down and it's really dark and everyone's haggard and weird and there's some guy outside screaming and it really is sobering to find yourself there. But then, you've made a big investment in this type of life, so you stay the course for a lot of people. And yeah, I just know a lot of people who are at that point where they're very they just don't exactly know what to do with their lives. They're just every day is a struggle because the ideas that led them there have no way of getting them out of the dark place that they're in. I don't know. There's a lot of metaphors in there, but yeah, it just seems like there's no, I don't know. There's no not really any good solutions except for a narrative, and I think that's kind of what you provide there as well. I mean, it's kind of a rich, very poetic way of explaining the importance of these values. And in some ways, I think there's not really any better way. You can't really provide a graph, or you can't really provide sources to this type of stuff. It's a vibes based thing, and I think that's what I like about it. It's the fact that we're summoning vibes, and I feel the only thing that can save a lot of people like this is the summoning of the right vibe, and making it interesting, making it high status, I guess, for people to change their ways and to accept that okay, it's not always better if you've created your existence yourself.
Yeah, and that's summoning vibe. Definitely, I've come to sort of see the book as an attempt to do a politics of vibe, really. Um, which, if I was going to put it in more kind of sensible words, I'd say it's a politics of sentiment, which is a rich tradition in conservative thought. A politics of sentiment, family, faith, flag, kin, place, deep affection for these things, or what Scruton calls wikiphilia, um, as actually being the basis of one's politics. Which is why I hesitated earlier to say that some kind of ideal society would have an ideology, because this isn't ideology really. Um, it's about our relationship with the concrete empirical world, um, which is a rich tradition of English conservatism, particularly English conservatism, I'd say. But the fact is, you reach a certain point in life, and for me, I kind of realised that that politics of sentiment, um, as it applied to me, was going to end up looking like the kind of stuff I talked about in the book, the kind of stuff that we're talking about. When you've been at that party at 4 a.m. in the morning and there's the guy screaming outside and everyone that's completely haggard. And what's the alternative vibe to that, rather than, what that original conservative politics was trying to react against, the bloodshed of the French Revolution, something like that, which was the equivalent. Yeah, and when I first kind of, I realised it was really weird the way culture moves is really weird. Culture is a very interesting thing, and it was just like a kind of there was a switch went in culture where all of a sudden all the vibe was on the right, and it happened very quickly. And you'd be online and you'd think, and you'd see, in that kind of period of, I don't know, 2016, 17, there wasn't really much discourse going on. It was just pure vibe, meme, the meme wars and stuff. And you think, well, this stuff's kind of funny. It's actually making some quite good points in a kind of weird, naive, childlike, visual, silly kind of way. And it was just kind of pure vibe. And, because of my upbringing and stuff, I'd always associated vibe, with the left. And all of a sudden it wasn't. It was all, on the left, it was all kind of like the stern school teacher telling people off and saying, well, actually, this is really problematic and all this kind of stuff. So, and then, it moved up to 2020 and that summer, I could completely understand why all my friends and stuff on the right kind of moved from vibe to kind of concrete policy proposals and, courses of action, campaigning, and thinking that how can we actually restrain some of this stuff? Because, what was all kind of campus wars in the early 2010s was all of a sudden kind of unleashed on society in 2020 and COVID. And I could see why it was clear that just kind of sharing hilarious memes with people wasn't going to have much effect if society was going to carry on going the way it was going. And And a lot of people I knew in the summer of 2020 were kind of contacting me wanting to start up kind of organised groups with a view to, like, affecting political parties and that kind of stuff. And I completely understand why, and I do think that stuff needs to be done. But I wanted to keep that kind of, I just wanted to keep the vibe alive, and I think that's really important. Because the stuff we're talking about is important. I'm not pretending that I want to kind of stand aside from the culture wars, and I'm not saying, one can kind of transcend them in any way. I don't think any of us can. And the stuff that we're fighting for is the most important, fundamental, existential stuff. It's human life, it's community, it's religion, it's society, it'd be a shame to see. Although I want to see the kind of ideas that we share in the discourse, I do want to see it move into kind of causing positive, constructive change, through policy and through politics and stuff like that. We've got the vibe on our side, so I suppose we've just got to keep that vibe there, keep the politics and vibe going, because I think it affects people a lot. I don't think people are affected by statistics. I'm sorry, I'm going on about statistics today, but people aren't converted by graphs. People don't have change. People have changes of heart, and that's because a vibe affects them, sentiment affects them, and that's what I think's really been really interesting about the right, for the last 6 or 7 years. Really, has been how all the vibes shifted. There's been the vibe shift, and that's and you can see it, and you can often see it quite weirdly in young people. There used to be this phrase in like music journalism in the 90s. People used to say the kids always know. So, like, if an actor was up and coming and you saw hundreds of kids there, like, the kids had this weird sense for where the vibe was. And I work with young people as an academic, and you see most of them are, just following the dominant way of thinking. But there's always a minority that can kind of detect the vibe shift. That they can kind of tap into the fact that something's happening, and that the really interesting and inventive and exploratory and meaningful parts of culture are happening on one side of this divide rather than the other.
Yeah, it is interesting to me as well that in the UK seems to have its own dynamic on this. It doesn't, obviously it's involved in all the conflicts in the US, but it doesn't really have the same kind of dissident sphere, or at least not the same. It's not really built out in the same way. It feels a little bit thin in the sense of, there's like an endless amount of institutions and new like just platforms for people to speak on dissident subjects in the US, but the UK not so much. And I feel like there's a tweet recently by anonymous writer Lin Manuel Rwanda from the UK, and I feel like he says this, obviously a spicy tweet from an anonymous, so take it with a grain of spiciness. The reason right wing groups in this country, and that's what the UK, traditionally consist entirely of biotrash is because anyone intelligent knows that joining one is like painting a target on your back, even if you share some of their opinions. And I feel like this strikes to something, and it probably ties into the Anglo spirit as well. I mean, there's a certain obedience in just being Anglo and obedience to the status quo. I mean, you don't necessarily want to be the person painting a target on your back. And I guess this applies all around the world, but an American is much more likely to not think it's such a bad thing to paint a target on their back. So I don't know. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I can see where it's coming from. And a lot, the organised dissident, I don't know if dissident's the right word, but the organised sphere in the UK does tend to be quite kind of cringe generally. I mean, the biggest difference is that in the States, the religious right are a big, powerful, acknowledged element of society with a lot of kind of electoral power behind them. So, and there's no equivalent to that here. The kind of religious right, not in terms of the discourse world, just in terms of society at large. There's no equivalent to that here at all. So it's completely different, and it's much more of a kind of minority thing. I suppose I don't really associate obedience with being Anglo that much. I suppose obedience in that rich way in which I'm trying to, or that very broad way I'm trying to explore it in the book, is tapping into English conservatism in a certain way. I think, I suppose the interesting thing, the thing that makes the UK quite different to a lot of places, and I suppose to a certain extent even the States, is this quite anomalous but undeniable issue around transgender ideology, the Turf Island.
Hmm.
And it is a distinct cultural phenomenon here, that there just seems to be a natural instinct in the English psyche. And I mean, and some would say British, but I just won't get into that now. There seems to be something in the English psyche which has granted a certain level of immunity to trans ideology that other places haven't necessarily had. Or other Western European countries, at least, and to a certain extent, the States. And I'd love to read, I haven't read a real kind of deep dive as to what it is in the English cultural sensibility that could explain this.
I
This
heard
is,
just as an aside here, I heard that it might be tied to a very online dynamic because England is the origin place of Mumsnet, and apparently a lot of the early criticism of the transgender movement, especially when they just started up the Tavistock clinic and things like that, started on Mumsnet, gained a lot of steam there, and it apparently riled up people to a point where it reached a certain critical mass where the propagandists weren't able to overcome the fact that there was already kind of a lot of steam behind the turf position. So, I mean, obviously, this might be a factor or not, but it's apparently an argument that's floating around there.
yeah, I think that's probably right. And I suppose going back kind of further and more deeply, there's this tradition of English empiricism and the kind of quintessential elements of a kind of English philosophy traditionally are a massive fear and suspicion and dislike of radical blueprints for social change disconnected from the real concrete conditions in which people live, which initially was associated with the French Revolution as the alternative to kind of abstract, bloodless view of reason that had no sense, the kind of rich sentiment and affection that actually exists between living, embodied people. And then in the late 19th century and up to the First World War and beyond would be contrasted with German idealism. And the idea that there's something very dangerous when a kind of abstract idea that might seem to work quite well on paper is actually superimposed into human lives. It always leads in the direction of kind of bloodshed and terror ultimately. And people will always kind of argue about that, but I think that's something that I've found quite interesting to observe, and would like to read more of a kind of genealogy of that kind of stuff. But yeah, in terms of that tweet you read out and the target on the back, it is the level of social ostracization which can be risked in the UK with opinions which, even from those who find them appalling in the States, they have heard them before and they are around, because there is this kind of power block of the religious right. It means the two discourses are completely different, but I suppose also Englishness tends to be kind of eccentric and a bit kind of odd, and and it kind of, it's weird because there is this kind of tradition. I see why people would say Anglos are kind of all about obedience and there's the aristocracy and the royalty and stuff like that, but at the same time, kind of traditionally in literature and poetry and stuff, the Englishman is kind of the eccentric that will never become a member of the herd. So kind of joining things, having political movements is always a problem here, because the English are just generally a bit of a pain and a bit weird and a bit contrarian and odd and silly. And, neither communism nor fascism was kind of, one of the unique things about us among European countries is that, Britain didn't go either way into either of those in the 20th century. And even weirdly with Catholicism, there's a tradition of people thinking Catholicism is deeply un-English because of the level of, because of the fact that it doesn't leave enough space for people to kind of have their own kind of eccentricities and stuff like that. So it means mobilizing the right in the way that there's, Margot and a populist right in the States. very, very difficult to do. I mean, the nearest we've got to a populist right was kind of Boris Johnson, but yeah, the less said about that, the better, probably.
Yes, I really do miss England, and I think a lot of my personal radicalization was just spending a lot of time in London, and essentially tapping into what it must feel like to be a Londoner, and essentially witnessing what's going on with the city, and what the options are. Because I think that's kind of the most disempowering thing is that the direction of the city is on rails, and of the country. I mean, in some ways, a lot of parts of the country are a bit more insulated from things. But I mean, I wonder what you make of it. Are you a Londoner yourself?
Yeah, kind of. It's complicated because my parents were divorced, so I kind of grew up in two different places. But yeah, London was a big part of my childhood. East London, definitely, and I would consider it home. Um, yeah, and I can see that, and I've known so many people that have come into London for a few years. Like everybody in the world comes to London for a few years, don't they? And I just found it the most appalling place. I always feel that knee-jerk defensive kind of instinct towards it. I think it's very difficult to know London from the outside because it's all outside. Very difficult to know the kind of communities, the stable continuities of certain communities here because you simply don't see them, those that are there. And I've always been quite conscious of something that is, very sadly is disappearing, withering on the vine, which is that there is just about, but there always was very perceptibly, a distinct working class identity to the Londoner. I mean, it was a distinct type, like someone from Liverpool is a Scouser, and there were Mancunians and Brummies. There was the Cockney, and the Cockney is still around, but obviously it's the community's kind of been pushed out to Essex and Kent, kind of counties around the eastern edges of the city. Yeah, I think it's what I like about London is that I like to think they're not isolated. I read some stuff that's written by people I know who live in a kind of village somewhere, and I just think, well, because when you're living in London and you're going into central London regularly, you are seeing all this stuff happening and kind of playing out before you all the time, and that kind of stimulates thought and reaction and stuff like that. But yeah, I just think I suppose what's interesting about that kind of working class community is it's I would hesitate to say white working class because it was always quite complicated ethnically. It's been complicated ethnically for like over 100 years. So kind of Italian and Polish and Jewish and stuff like that. And seeing that original kind of London working class community gradually get pushed further and further out and gradually get more and more kind of isolated in particular forms of housing surrounded by, gentrification and stuff like that. I just kind of, it was, for me, it was more about culture than it was about race, I suppose. And this is where I'd be quite, I might say awkwardly among some on the right, but something I tried to allude to in the book at some point was that it's really about religion and culture is where the problems are. So, for example, it's much harder those working class communities were not able to fuse and interrelate and kind of for there to be cultural interaction so much with Islamic communities as there had been traditionally with Italian and Polish and stuff like that. Whereas that was possible with kind of Afro-Caribbean communities where, ultimately the kind of the Cockney type became so deeply influenced by kind of like elements of Afro-Caribbean culture, and that kind of happened quite naturally. So one of the points I try and make in the book is that this whole debate about kind of immigration. If you've lived in London for years, you realise it's not. Immigration is the big issue, obviously, but the discussion that's never had is kind of which community and why, and which communities might might kind of work in certain settings and which communities might not. That's the kind of unspoken question, So when you talk about, um, and I suppose an advantage or something you just can't deny if you live in London, that you have simply seen pretty much any possible community kind of all thrown together, and seen kind of bits where it can kind of work out, and then a lot of bits where it kind of can't work out. But I completely understand people I know have come over. Actually, of all the people I've known that have come over, the ones that have been most critical of London historically, in my experience, have been Italians, funnily enough. Who've just found it the most appallingly bleak place imaginable, and been really unhappy, and talked a lot about how Italy's much better, and then gone home. That's all been quite entertaining to watch.
Yeah, the interesting part is that I don't think I like any other place in the world as much as I like London and Essex and Surrey and that whole area of the world. But I think the black pilling part about it is it was just that it was defenseless. It was this absolutely magical, unique place, a cradle of civilization, if there ever was one, and it was essentially being pillaged. And that's the sad part. And no, I mean, the Londoners that I've met and the people that I've met that were from kind of the outskirts or so, just absolutely lovely people, but they just had no immune system against all of this. And it was just, it's kind of like, I don't know, the scene in Bambi where the mother dies, and but just every day. I don't know, it's just, yeah, this kind of deep sadness about the whole thing. Yeah, it just, and then, regarding the immigration debate, I mean, I think it's I think it's true, that there's always a possibility of integration. I mean, I don't think there's a population on this earth that's completely not able to integrate with another population, but it's always a question of numbers. I think the UK has broken through any sort of potential threshold, because the problem is, when you get to the point where you have little Karachi next to little Bucharest, little this and that, and you have essentially, self-contained enclaves of people. That's a completely different thing to people being thrown together. You don't you after a certain threshold of immigration, you don't throw people together. You just throw them into small, little Romania or something like that, and that community has obviously a dynamic of itself. I mean, it's more similar to Bucharest than it is to London, and that is just the way it happens everywhere in the world. I mean, it's like bees create beehives, and ants create ant hills, and after a certain threshold, you know, Pakistanis will create Karachi. That's the result pretty much everywhere in the world. And yeah, I mean that's essentially what you have in London, and might be an interesting experiment, but uh, yeah, long term it's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I was so in favour of Brexit was because of people that lived in London, but for whom it wasn't their home. And Brexit didn't quite do what it was meant to do on that front. But where I get very frustrated is when people are clearly London's big. These parts of London are being used as a kind of dormitory for people to come and stay and work, to send money back home and then go back home for weeks and weeks in the summer, and often weeks and weeks at Christmas as well. And there's no roots. I mean, obviously, with that kind of conservative tradition and stuff I've talked about, it's all about roots. And it was the transience of the population that I think I found most difficult. And yeah, I've just known so many. I mean, the majority of people I know have not been anywhere else in the UK other than London. And yeah, been to the city of origin, regularly 2 or 3 times a year. I mean, it was just really weird, and it was really weird living in an area of London that, for me, the big divide is as much about class as it is about anything else. So, where I differ from a lot of people on the right is around some of the discourse around gentrification and stuff like that, because we had the same pattern was happening there, where you had people who were, had properties in central London, which were basically a kind of dormitory for them to come and stay and work and maximise. People talk about London, as a place you can maximise your self advantage by earning a lot of money and then going back to where your real home is on a really long term basis. I mean, living in that way for a long time, basically second home. Um, yeah, the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, and the kind of stuff that I think enables human communities to be stable and have trust, and for people to live meaningful lives, really involve a commitment to place as well. And you had that in the original kind of working class communities of London. Massive commitment to place. In fact, like working class Londoners are probably the people I know in my whole life who go the least far. And they wouldn't even go like one stop further away on the tube. They're completely enclosed in their own communities. And seeing that go has been really sad, and I suppose that's why a lot of reactionary writing I found really interesting when I first discovered it, because it seemed to me to have the kind of mood that I felt at watching a city that I deeply loved and will always love, which I'll always be very proud of in some ways. Someone described, I can't remember where I read it, but someone described reactionary writing as a kind of exhilarated despair. And that's my relationship with London, it's a relationship of an exhilarated despair. It always exhilarates me. But there's always despair as well.
Yeah, I mean that's very understandable, and I share that feeling, and I wish I could. The thing is, when I visit London, it's just the exhilaration. I think the despair sets in after about a month, but it's nice to be able to to do that just for a few days. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah. On this cheery note, because we're all about the exhilaration and despair on this podcast, I want to ask you about your recommendation of a subversive thinker, someone who maybe is inspirational in your work, or someone who's just good and people should read more of or be interested in.
Yeah, I think I would recommend people engage much more with a 19th century German philosopher called Wilhelm Dilthey, Dilthey. You can't really call subversive in the sense he was a very kind of traditional figure in his own day in late 19th century Berlin, but his thinking is has a lot of those kinds of themes I've been talking about today. And although he's German, he had this huge fear about abstract ideas being just simply superimposed on society. He believed that, and argued, he had a philosophy that was based on the supposition that kind of empirical concrete life is completely distinct, and you can't articulate being human without a way of doing that. And he thought the way that we do that is through poetry. He thought human beings understand their own lives in a naturally poetic fashion. And there's just an irreducibleness to being human, which is best expressed through poetry. And he kind of gets dwarfed completely by Heidegger, who borrowed a bit from him and then did lots of other stuff with it. And Heidegger's become the kind of famous, the big guy in the 20th century. But I think people need to go back to Dilthey. So when I get the time, hopefully later in life, I'm going to work a bit more on him and how to introduce some of his ideas, I think, into the kinds of things that we talk about in the discourse at the moment, I guess.
That's really interesting because it mirrors a lot of the findings in the essentially kind of the structuring of thought related to language. I don't know if you've heard about this. There are books by Lakoff, like Metaphors We Live By, and Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, which are all about the fact that essentially the way we structure knowledge is through language and metaphors. That a lot of essentially the way we represent the world is structured in metaphors and sometimes and just also kind of how we structure categories around these metaphors. So it's there's the essential conclusion to this is that there's a certain irreducibility and very hard to map a lot of the ways in which we see ourselves and which we communicate ourselves and which we understand ourselves. So, yeah, I think this, it's there's some empirical, there's some graphs, some tables related to this insight. So I think it's nice when sometimes we can whip out a graph to say this is really true.
Yeah, definitely. We can't live without them, but Yeah, I haven't read what you're talking about, but I can see the similarities definitely, um, and and it connects with a lot of stuff in the discourse in terms of we think through these types or similes, analogies, metaphors, and stuff like that, and um, there is extreme kind of attacks on human cognition happening through kind of wokeness and stuff, whereby you can't think in types at all because it's stereotypes, and actually um, we can't think properly at all unless we can associate particular characteristics with certain behaviours and things like that. And that's actually how we understand our own lives. So, yeah, I guess that's the stuff that interests me, is kind of pushing way beyond kind of the surface discourse and trying to see how this kind of stuff is actually affecting the way that people relate to the world and how kind of dangerous that is. And Dilthey provides a nice kind of counterpoint to it, I think. But we can never avoid the occasional graph.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, thank you so much. This is a unique recommendation, has not been mentioned on the show before, so I love that. And yeah, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to point people toward Obedience is Freedom, which you can find on Amazon and everywhere fine books are sold. And is there any other place that you'd like to have people read your work or investigate what you're up to?
Um, no, I think the book kind of sums it up really. I've been doing the occasional bit for the critic, and yeah, I guess on Twitter the occasional piece I do here and there when I find the time, I'll always put it up on Twitter. And I'm thinking about another book as well. So in a couple of years there'll be the sequel. So yeah, watch this space.
Excellent, excellent. I'll put all those in the show notes. And yeah, I want to thank you again for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.